Hello, welcome to Learning Studio. If you have queries about when, where, why and how does psychology evolve, so you are at right place, because this video will answer all your queries. To make your concept clear, watch this video till end. This video will cover the following topics: introduction, problems in writing, history of psychology, where to start, what to include, choice of approach, why study the history of psychology, perspective, deeper understanding, recognition of fads and fashion, avoiding repetition of mistakes, a source of valuable ideas, and curiosity. Let's begin this video. The definition of psychology has changed as the focus of psychology has changed. At various times in history, psychology has been defined as the study of the psyche or the mind, of the spirit, of consciousness, and more recently as the study of, or the science of, behavior. Perhaps, then, we can arrive at an acceptable definition of modern psychology by observing the activities of contemporary psychologists. Some seek the biological correlates of mental events such as sensation, perception, or ideation. Some concentrate on understanding the principles that govern learning and memory. Some seek to understand humans by studying non-human animals. Some study unconscious motivation. Some seek to improve industrial organizational productivity, educational practices, or child-rearing practices by utilizing psychological principles. Some attempt to explain human behavior in terms of evolutionary theory. Some attempt to account for individual differences among people in such areas as personality, intelligence, and creativity. Some are primarily interested in perfecting therapeutic tools that can be used to help individuals with mental disturbances. Some focus on the strategies that people use in adjusting to the environment or in problem solving. Some study how language develops and how, once developed, it relates to a variety of cultural activities. Some explore computer programs as models for understanding human thought processes. Still others study how humans change over the course of their lives as a function of maturation and experience. These are just a few of the activities that engage contemporary psychologists. Clearly, no single definition of psychology can take into consideration the wide variety of activities engaged in by the more than 148,000 members and affiliates of the American Psychological Association, not to mention the many other psychologists around the world. It seems best to say simply that psychology is defined by the professional activities of psychologists. These activities are characterized by a rich diversity of methods, topics of interest, and assumptions about human nature. A primary purpose is to examine the origins of modern psychology and to show that most of the concerns of today's psychologists are manifestations of themes that have been part of psychology for hundreds or, in some cases, thousands of years. Problems in writing a history of psychology. The problems were that from where to start. Literally, psychology means the study of the psyche, or mind, and this study is as old as the human species. The ancients, for example, attempted to account for dreams, mental illness, emotions, and fantasies. Was this psychology, or did psychology commence when explanations of human cognitive experience, such as those proposed by the early Greeks, became more systematic? Plato and Aristotle, for example, created elaborate theories that attempted to account for such processes as memory, perception, and learning. Is this the point at which psychology started? Or did psychology come into existence when it became a separate science in the 19th century? It is common these days to begin a history of psychology at the point where psychology became a separate science. This approach is unsatisfactory for two reasons. One, it ignores the vast philosophical heritage that molded psychology into the type of science that it eventually became. And two, it omits important aspects of psychology that are outside the realm of science. Although it is true that since the mid-19th century, psychology has, to a large extent, embraced the scientific method, many highly influential psychologists did not feel compelled to follow the dictates of the scientific method. Their work cannot be ignored. The major Greek philosophers whose explanations of human behavior and thought processes are the ones that philosophers and psychologists have been reacting to ever since. What to include? Typically, in determining what to include in a history of anything, one traces those people, ideas, and events that led to what is important now. This takes this approach by looking at the way psychology is today and then attempting to show how it became that way. There is at least one major danger in using the present state of psychology as a guide in writing its history. However, Stocking in 1965 calls such an approach to history presentism, as contrasted with what he calls historicism. the study of the past for its own sake, without attempting to show the relationship between the past and present. Copleston in 2001 describes historicism as it applies to philosophy. If one wishes to understand the philosophy of a given epoch, one has to make the attempt to understand the mentality and presuppositions of the men who lived in that epoch, irrespective of whether one shares that mentality and those presuppositions or not. On the other hand, presentism attempts to understand the past in terms of contemporary knowledge and standards. Presentism implies that the present state of a discipline represents its highest state of development, and that earlier events led directly to this state. In this view, the latest is the best, although the present or current psychology is not necessarily the best psychology because the field is simply too diverse to make such a judgment. At present, psychology is exploring many topics, methods, and assumptions. Which of these explorations will survive for inclusion in future history books is impossible to say, using psychology's present as a frame of reference. Therefore, does not necessarily assume that psychology's past evolved into its present or that current psychology represents the best psychology. In general, then, I assume historicism provides a better framework for understanding psychology's history than presentism. However, Lovett in 2006 said that no matter how much historicism is emphasized, presentism cannot be completely avoided when reporting history. Although contemporary psychology provides a guide for deciding what individuals, ideas, and events to include in a history of psychology, there remains the question of how much detail to include. If, for example, we attempted to trace all causes of an idea, we would be engaged in an almost unending search. In fact, after attempting to trace the origins of an idea or a concept in psychology, we are left with the impression that nothing is ever entirely new. Seldom, if ever, is a single individual solely responsible for an idea or a concept. Rather, individuals are influenced by other individuals, who in turn were influenced by other individuals, and so on. A history of almost anything, then, can be viewed as an unending stream of interrelated events. The great individuals are typically those who synthesize existing nebulous ideas into a clear, forceful viewpoint. Attempting to fully document the origins of an important idea or concept in a history book would involve so many details that the book would become too long and boring. The usual solution is to omit large amounts of information, thus making the history selective. Typically, only those individuals who did the most to develop or popularize an idea are covered. Choice of approach. Once the material to be included in a history of psychology has been chosen, the choice of approach remains. One approach is to emphasize the influence of such non-psychological factors as developments in other sciences, political climate, technological advancement, and economic conditions. Together, these and other factors create a zeitgeist, or a spirit of the times, which many historians consider vital to the understanding of any historical development. An alternative is to take the great person approach by emphasizing the works of individuals such as Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Darwin, or Freud. Ralph Waldo Emerson embraced the great person approach to history, saying that history resolves itself very easily into the biography of a few stout and earnest persons. Another approach is the historical development approach, showing how various individuals or events contributed to changes in an idea or concept through the years. For example, one could focus on how the idea of mental illness has changed throughout history. In his approach to the history of psychology, E.G. Boring stressed the importance of the zeitgeist in determining whether, or to what extent, an idea or viewpoint will be accepted. Clearly, ideas do not occur in a vacuum. A new idea, to be accepted or even considered, must be compatible with existing ideas. In other words, a new idea will be tolerated only if it arises within an environment that can assimilate it. An idea or viewpoint that arises before people are prepared for it will not be understood well enough to be critically evaluated. The important point here is that validity is not the only criterion by which ideas are judged. Psychological and sociological factors are at least as important. New ideas are always judged within the context of existing ideas. If new ideas are close enough to existing ideas, they will at least be understood. Whether they are accepted, rejected, or ignored is another matter. Why study the history of psychology? Perspective. As we have seen, ideas are seldom, if ever, born full-blown. Rather, they typically develop over a long period of time. Seeing ideas in their historical perspective allows the student to more fully appreciate the subject matter of modern psychology. However, Viewing the problems and questions currently dealt with in psychology as manifestations of centuries-old problems and questions is humbling and sometimes frustrating. After all, if psychology's problems have been worked on for centuries, should they not be solved by now? Conversely, knowing that our current studies have been shared and contributed to by some of the greatest minds in human history is exciting. Deeper understanding. With greater perspective comes deeper understanding. With a knowledge of history, the student need not take on faith the importance of the subject matter of modern psychology. A student with a historical awareness knows where psychology's subject matter came from and why it is considered important, just as we gain a greater understanding of a person's current behavior by learning more about that person's past experiences. So do we gain a greater understanding of current psychology by studying its historical origins. Boring made this point in relation to experimental psychologists. The experimental psychologist needs historical sophistication within his own sphere of expertness. Without such knowledge, he sees the present in distorted perspective. He mistakes old facts and old views for new, and he remains unable to evaluate the significance of new movements and methods. In this matter, I can hardly state my faith too strongly. A psychological sophistication that contains no component of historical orientation seems to me to be no sophistication at all. Recognition of fads and fashions. While studying the history of psychology, one is often struck by the realization that a viewpoint does not always fade away because it is incorrect. Rather, some viewpoints disappear simply because they become unpopular. What is popular in psychology varies with the zeitgeist. For example, when psychology first emerged as a science, the emphasis was on pure science. That is, on the gaining of knowledge without any concern for its usefulness. Later, when Darwin's theory became popular, psychology shifted its attention to human processes that were related to survival or that allowed humans to live more effective lives. Today, one major emphasis in psychology is on cognitive processes, and that emphasis is due, in part, to recent advances in computer technology. The illustrious personality theorist Gordon W. Allport spoke of fashions in psychology. Our profession progresses in fits and starts, largely under the spur of fashion. We never seem to solve our problems or exhaust our concepts. We only grow tired of them. Fashions have their amusing and their serious sides. We can smile at the way bearded problems receive tonsorial transformation. Having tired of suggestibility, we adopt the new hairdo known as persuasibility. Modern ethnology excites us, and we are not troubled by the recollection that a century ago John Stuart Mill staked down the term to designate the new science of human character. Reinforcement appeals to us, but not the age-long debate over hedonism. The problem of freedom we brush aside in favor of choice points. We avoid the body-mind problem, but are in fashion when we talk about brain models. Old wine, we find, tastes better from new bottles. The serious side of the matter enters when we and our students forget that the wine is indeed old. Picking up a recent number of the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, it is discovered that the 21 articles written by American psychologists confine 90% of their references to publications of the past 10 years. Although most of the problems they investigate have gray beards, is it any wonder that our graduate students reading our journals conclude that literature more than a decade old has no merit and can be safely disregarded? At a recent doctoral examination, the candidate was asked what his thesis on physiological and psychological conditions of stress had to do with the body-mind problem. He confessed that he had never heard of the problem. An undergraduate said that all he knew about Thomas Hobbes was that he sank with the Leviathan when it hit an iceberg in 1912. With such examples of how research topics move in and out of vogue in science, we see again that factuality is not the only variable determining whether an idea is accepted. By studying the emotional and societal factors related to the accumulation of knowledge, the student can place currently accepted knowledge into a more realistic perspective. Such a perspective allows the student to realize that the process through which a body of knowledge is accepted as important or as true is at least partially subjective and arbitrary. As zeitgeists change, so does what is considered fashionable in science, and psychology has not been immune to this process. Avoiding repetition of mistakes. George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Such repetition would be bad enough if it involved only successes, because so much time and energy would be wasted. It is especially unfortunate, however, if mistakes are repeated. Psychology has had its share of mistakes and dead ends. One mistake was the embracing of phrenology, the belief that personality characteristics could be understood by analyzing the bumps and depressions on a person's skull. One dead end may have been the entire school of structuralism. whose members attempted to study the elements of thought by using the introspective method. It is generally thought that the efforts of the structuralists, although extremely popular at the time, were sterile and unproductive. Yet it was important for psychology that such an effort was made, for we learned that such an approach led to little that was useful. This and other important lessons would be lost if the errors of the past were repeated because of a lack of historical information. A source of valuable ideas. By studying history, we may discover ideas that were developed at an earlier time but, for whatever reason, remained dormant. The history of science offers several examples of an idea taking hold only after being rediscovered long after it had originally been proposed. This fact fits nicely into the zeitgeist interpretation of history, suggesting that some conditions are better suited for the acceptance of an idea than others. The notions of evolution, unconscious motivation, and conditioned responses had been proposed and reproposed several times before they were offered in an atmosphere that allowed their critical evaluation. Even Copernicus's revolutionary heliocentric theory had been entertained by the Greeks many centuries before he proposed it. A final example is that of lateralization of brain function. Many believe that the idea that the two cerebral hemispheres function in radically different ways is a new one. However, over 100 years ago, Brown-Sequard's article "Have We Two Brains or One?" was one of many written on the topic. In fact, important scientific ideas can be rejected more than once before they are finally appreciated. Feyerabend said, "The history of science is full of theories which were pronounced dead, then resurrected, then pronounced dead again only to celebrate another triumphant comeback. It makes sense to preserve faulty points of view for possible future use. The history of ideas, methods, and prejudices is an important part of the ongoing practice of science, and this practice can change direction in surprising ways. No doubt, many potentially fruitful ideas in psychology's history are still waiting to be tried again under new, perhaps more receptive, circumstances." Curiosity. Instead of asking the question, why study the history of psychology? It might make more sense to ask, why not? Many people study U.S. history because they are interested in the United States, and younger members of a family often delight in hearing stories about the early days of the family's elder members. In other words, wanting to know as much as possible about a topic or person of interest, including a topic's or a person's history, is natural. Psychology is not an exception. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.